What would you do if someone you trusted stood up in front of your entire family and called you worthless trash? Would you cry? Would you fight back? Or would you stay quiet and wait for the perfect moment to strike back? Because that's exactly what happened to me, and less than 24 hours later the man who humiliated me was watching his world fall apart because of 3 simple text messages. If you've ever dreamed of dishing out justice to someone who thought they could walk all over you, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is not just a story, this is a masterclass in carefully planned revenge. Picture a family gathering, the kind you see in movies, fine china glasses catching the light and laughter filling the room, but for me family nights like this were never warm, they always came with a cold edge because my husband's family carried an attitude of superiority that made me feel small. His mother gave polite smiles that never reached her eyes, his sisters whispered behind hands when I entered, and his father ruled the room with a mix of wealth, bravado, and a cruel little smile that said he knew he could crush anyone with a sentence. That evening the long oak table was set, someone had brought a chocolate cake, there was wine, people moved between conversations. I sat quietly at my place doing everything I could to be invisible, to be safe, to avoid becoming his target. He sat at the head of the table, my father-in-law, the man whose words cut deeper than knives, who believed respect was his right not earned, and then out of nowhere he leaned back, looked me in the face and said loud enough that the chandelier could have heard, "You are worthless trash." If you've ever been publicly humiliated, you know what happens in that split second. Your brain runs through 1,000 responses, your chest tightens, the blood rushes to your face, your hands go numb, and you feel exposed like a puppet whose strings someone else is holding. My first physical reaction was shock. My fork clattered against porcelain, the room stopped like someone pressed a pause button. My husband sat beside me, jaw clenched but silent, no defense, no word in my favor. I have to tell you what happened next because it will tell you who I am. I could have stood up, screamed at him, told him to crawl back into whatever hole his arrogance came from, but I didn't. Instead I smiled politely, because politeness can be a weapon. I kept my voice low, calm and steady. I said, "You're right, sir." Then I placed my napkin on the table and I walked out. Walking away felt like swallowing glass, but I had a plan. Forming under the veneer of calm was a storm. I drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. By the time I pulled into the driveway I was no longer hurt, I was furious, but furious in a way that sharpens focus, not in a way that scatters it. I replayed his words in my head, and each repetition became a fuel for something else, a decision to not be the person he thought I was. You need context to understand why I had the upper hand. My husband and his father were involved in a major business deal, one of those kinds of deals where contracts, pages of fine print, and a group of investors were sitting on the edge waiting for signatures. It was complicated and fragile, and most importantly at that moment it depended on trust and internal approvals, and one person's decision could collapse the whole thing. My husband had trusted me, he'd told me the details, the loopholes, the timelines, and because of that I held information that could make or break the deal. So that night I made a choice. I would not retaliate by screaming, I would retaliate by winning quietly, by dismantling the one thing he valued, his control and reputation. The next morning at exactly 10 a.m. 3 messages were sent, one after the other, and each hit harder than the last. The first message went to his lawyer, 5 stark words: "The deal is off." Not a plea, not a negotiation, just a fact. It wasn't dramatic, but it needed to be precise, because at that point the contract was not fully binding, and silence from the key parties could be fatal to the whole arrangement. The lawyer forwarded the message. Someone else called, an investor. Within hours questions started to bubble, and the fragile architecture that had taken months to construct began to wobble. The second message came from my husband, and I didn't force it. He confronted his father that morning, and the 4 words he sent after were pure devastating disappointment. "I can't believe you." Those words weren't angry, they were a verdict, because a son's disappointment can break a man who built his identity on being feared. My husband's voice had been muffled in family rooms for years. Maybe he swallowed his words before because of habit or fear, but this time when he stood up he did it with something steadier than anger, with a boundary he hadn't had before. The third message was mine, simple, 5 words: "Do not mess with trash." It felt deliciously small and perfectly brutal. I didn't want to gloat, I didn't need to. My satisfaction came from the cascade set in motion, the quiet symmetry of it all. The man who thought he could reduce someone to nothing was now left with the wreckage of his own arrogance, and a son who no longer wanted to be near him during a crisis. What followed was cold and methodical. The investors who had been cautiously optimistic now had excuses to step back. They called their advisors. The media, the business networks got wind of the delay, and the delay became a story. Reputation matters more than cash sometimes, because reputation is how you get another deal next month and the month after, and when you lose it, doors begin to close. At family dinners people began to whisper about his temper, about his impulsive remarks, about how someone might be picking up the pieces of a man who had never been used to other people making decisions without his blessing. Meanwhile I didn't parade around announcing my victory. I answered a few concerned calls. I kept my tone neutral. When asked what happened I said nothing more than necessary, and let silence be my echo. The silence forced the family to talk to each other, and in that conversation the truth pieces together painfully fast. People began to see what the patriarch had always been through. Others began to feel embarrassed by how easily he'd used cruel words to assert power. The humiliation he had used on me reflected back on him like a mirror, and it was not flattering. The turning point for me wasn't the texts themselves, it was the moment his son looked at him for who he really was and didn't flinch, the shock on his face when the investors said we're out, and the slow realization that your son will not cover for your cruelty. That image is burned into my memory, and in that image there is justice. I want to draw this out so you feel the weight of the scene. His phone buzzed 3 times, first a lawyer, then his son, then me. He stared, then his face went pale, then he called my husband demanding to know what happened, and my husband did something he hadn't done since they were kids. He told the truth. He told his father that what he'd said was unacceptable and that he would no longer enable that kind of behavior. Not dramatic, just a boundary, but boundaries are rock slides in families built on fear. There's a part of me that thinks about the small details when I remember that morning, the way sunlight hit the kitchen tile, the way the coffee had gone cold on the counter, the sudden lack of sound in the house where there used to always be someone giving orders. It's the little slices of normal that make the fall from power so stark. He was left with empty rooms of conversations that had suddenly dried up, and I was left with a sense of peace that surprised me, a quiet steadiness like a heavy coat on a cold day. I'll be honest, some people called me cold. They whispered that I weaponized my knowledge. They called it vindictive. They were right to notice the steadiness of my actions, but they missed the cost of silence. When someone calls you trash in front of a room, you don't get to choose humiliation quietly. It's imposed on you, and living with it without response might have been worse for me than these texts ever were. I weighed dignity against reaction and chose dignity, executed with intelligence. 1 week later, the fallout had real consequences. The business partners retreated. A few relatives stopped showing up at Sunday lunches. He stopped receiving calls from a certain club he'd always boasted about memberships to. The cracks in his social armor widened into chasms. The more he tried to fix things with apologies, the fewer people trusted him. The apology came too late, and the apology sounded like a bandage over a broken dam. There is a part of this story that is about proving something to myself. I needed to show that the person who had called me worthless could not define me. My revenge was never about making him suffer in raw cruelty. It was about reclaiming my narrative and creating consequences proportionate to what he'd inflicted. I wanted a justice that felt clean, not theatrical. That's why the quiet texts worked better than any public confrontation. When I saw him again, it was at another family gathering, but this time his eyes were different. He avoided looking at me directly, and when he did, his gaze slid away like a man who'd been caught examining his own reflection and found it cracked. He tried to make jokes to mask his discomfort, but the laughter was hollow. He was smaller, not because of size but because reputation had been pulled like a thread and his coat unraveled. My husband and I were different after that night. He looked at me with a mixture of admiration and grief for what he had allowed to happen. He apologized in private more times than I could count, and he began to stand up not only for me but for himself. He'd been living in his father's shadow, and thanks to that morning his own voice came back stronger and clearer. My role in that was complicated. I didn't want to be a puppet master. I wanted to be someone who helped him see something he had been avoiding. People will ask, isn't revenge hollow? Doesn't it leave bitterness? The answer is the same one I would give you if you'd been reduced to silence for years. It's not about bitterness, it's about restoring balance. If someone takes your dignity, then balance demands restitution, whether that comes from words or from consequences. My revenge didn't ruin a life, it forced a reckoning, and sometimes reckoning is the only language certain people understand. If you're listening and you're wondering what you would do in that position, I will tell you this: plan with your head, not your heart. Don't act in a way that will trap you later. Don't burn bridges you will regret, and most of all, know what leverage you have. Every situation is different. Sometimes the best revenge is walking away, sometimes it's winning with silence. In my case, I used information and restraint to let consequences do the work. There were days later where I questioned myself, where I sat with a cup of tea and imagined alternative endings. Maybe I could have forgiven, maybe I could have negotiated a simpler path, but those were the quiet nights, and they taught me something else. They taught me that self-respect is not negotiable, and that standing up with strategy is not the same as stooping to cruelty. People who accused me of being cold didn't live inside that dining room that night. They didn't feel all the eyes on me. They didn't hear the laughter die when he spoke. Now whenever I think back, I don't feel triumphant in a fleeting way. I feel steady. It's not a gloating victory, it's a sober one, like closing a chapter that needed closing. The man who called me trash still exists. He still has a life, but he has fewer people in it who will let him behave like that, and that is enough. The real victory was teaching my husband that our dignity together mattered more than his fear of rocking the boat. If this story chilled you or made your blood hum, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed. And if you want more stories where people take back their power, subscribe, because I have more to share, and every one of them proves there are smarter ways to teach people a lesson. Some final things to remember: if you are planning something like this, think of proportionality. Don't cause irreparable harm. Think of legality. Don't burn bridges that may be needed later. And most importantly, don't let revenge become the thing that defines you. Let it be an instrument to restore your life, not to ruin it. If you enjoyed this narrative and want a version with alternate reactions, a version where the father-in-law fights back, or a softer version where the protagonist chooses a different route, let me know in the comments. I can spin out scenes, give you alternate dialogues, and even a version designed for dramatized voice acting. Thanks for listening to this one, and remember, often the quiet moves are the most devastating, and dignity held with intelligence is never trash.